Welcome to the Sandwich Generation Survival Guide with your hosts, Jodi Argentino and Candace Dellacona. Thanks for joining us, Jodi.
Yeah, well, we had a lot of fun on the last one talking about some conflicts in families with, Britney Spears' family and Michael Oher's family. And so this week we wanted to talk a little bit about communication in those high conflict situations, whether it's work or friends or family. I see it most of the time with co-parents, but sort of figuring out the best ways to have communication in high conflict situations is something that helps all of us, I think, in everyday life.
Yeah, I mean, I think, for our listeners, when Jodi and I prepare episodes like this, we think of all the different issues that will impact our sandwich generation listeners, and the best way to impart information that we have or knowledge that we've sort of acquired along the way, whether it's through clients or through our own lives. And one of Jodi's amazing suggestions was this exact topic. And so as we were preparing for it, and I'd mentioned this to Jodi earlier, that it felt like a topic that was going to squarely be in sort of Jodi's camp, right? Jodi as our family law representative, our matrimonial lawyer, and someone in the family law space. And really, thinking about it for 3 seconds more, I realized, this is such a universal topic, right? Communication and effective communication, how we can help the members of the sandwich generation, our own clients, can effectively communicate with each other.
Right. So the one communication method I have seen work best in both mental health and law, right, is a concept called B.I.F.F, which stands for brief, informative, friendly, and firm. I've also heard focused substituted for either the friendly or the firm. And Bill Eddy is the brain behind this concept and wrote B.I.F.F, Quick Responses to High Conflict People. And he is the president of High Conflict Institute, et cetera. So I want to give him due credit because this is a concept that we use so often in parent coordination and any other training for people, that we need to know how to communicate without escalating a situation, right? So it's designed to calm a hostile situation.
Yeah.
Or hostile conversation. And I've used it in my own personal life tons of times.
Yeah. So, before we get into sort of like this amazing methodology that is incredibly useful, I think it's important to stop and talk about, what is communication, right? So the communication, right, is transferring ideas, information, or even your feelings between two parties or more. And communication can be done in all sorts of ways. Obviously, you can send emails, verbal, nonverbal. And I think breaking it down to think about the ways in which we communicate, the methods we choose, will really help us implement a concept like B.I.F.F. So, I think it is important to think about how we communicate, and when it's verbal, are we talking about communication that's respectful? Is it direct enough? Is it vague to the listener? And then, you can get into nonverbal stuff, which is actually really fascinating, because what I've read and what I understand to be nonverbal communication is it's intuitive and it's unconscious, but nonetheless can be really damaging, right?
Right. We come to every situation with our own schema, right? Our own set of sunglasses, our own set of eyeglasses of how we see the world based on how we grew up. We have our own trigger. Right. Actually, I heard a word today called glimmers, which is the opposite of triggers. So it's like the things that bring you joy during the day. And so, but we all come to every conversation and every situation with our own triggers from our own past, our own culture. So, so I think part of the concept of B.I.F.F communication is to sort of pull those things out as best you possibly can. Yeah. And it's designed for written communication, right? Because when we're having verbal communication, as we often show on our podcast, not always the right words come out, right? So, so there's not as much of an ability to control your own expression or your own instincts or your own innate way of responding to something.
Your
so
reactions, right?
Right, your actions. Thank you. it's a lot easier to do that when you can write it down, look at it, double check it, put it away for a few minutes, go back to it, rather than if you're on the spot in a conversation and having that willpower to say, I don't want to have this conversation right now, or let's discuss this in a different format. That takes a lot of self-control. That is,
Yeah.
especially when you're in like a defensive or being something where you're being accused. That's a lot to ask of anyone.
Yeah. I mean, I think like the double-edged sword, right, with written communication is the things that you point out. The positives are it gives you the opportunity to really sort of craft what your thoughts are and take a breath to talk about really what the heart of the matter is in the most effective way, or what you perceive to be the most effective way. And the flip side of that, the downside of written communication is if you aren't doing a great job at expressing yourself, or perhaps you use the wrong words that are maybe inflammatory or hurtful to someone, you've just memorialized it by putting it in writing. So I think it's really important that you bring up that, this B.I.F.F approach is an approach that we talk about with our clients and our loved ones in writing. I think it's really important to think about too, how a lot of us are communicating, which is text messages.
Absolutely. Which can be it's so hard because first of all, it's immediate gratification, right? Immediate response. Because how many people actually can say, okay, I'm going to respond to this text when I am in a good place and I am focused, etc. The whole point of a text is it's totally invasive in your world.
Yes.
And in that respect, it's almost worse than oral communication, right? Verbal communication, because
it's so reactive.
Not even paying yes, and you're not even necessarily paying attention.
Yeah.
I did want to say I jumped up and grabbed a book off my shelf, Candace, while we were chatting, because I have this book called Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg, which is phenomenal. It's not a B.I.F.F equivalent, completely different strategies, but it talks about when you are verbally expressing yourself or in writing, not assigning an intent to the other person's word. And something you had said about how we say things and sometimes they're misinterpreted or it comes off the wrong way, whatever. I think that is something that it just sparked my memory, and I was like, oh, let me go grab that book, because that's exactly what we're talking about in this whole concept, is how to avoid other people's triggers, but that makes me feel like I'm saying you should walk on eggshells, and I'm not saying that.
Well, I mean, I think, the best way to communicate is the way in which you want the listener to hear it. And so I think, when you employ strategies like this, it allows you to really get to the heart of the matter and make sure that the message can be delivered in the best possible way with the best possible chance of the person who needs to hear it receiving it, right?
Right. It's about the outcome, right? Like you're trying to elicit a particular thing from the other person. Now, I'm going to say this doesn't necessarily apply to someone who's doing it in an evil way, right? Like if your intention is to hurt the other person, obviously this is not the podcast for you. If the intention is to get across information and or de-escalate a situation, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, let's get into it too. And let's talk about, the best ways that we've found, in a professional setting, certainly. And I think they can easily be employed in your interpersonal life. My clients, when you're dealing with an aging loved one, a parent going into a nursing home, and siblings have different ideas about how things should go. And in your life, when you're advising clients on ending a relationship and co-parenting with someone who you may not be the biggest fan of anymore, and how to communicate with those people, right?
Right. And I love when people say to me, well, I'm a really good communicator. And I'm like, see, the thing is about that is one person can't be a good communicator, because you can only be a good communicator if you are actually adjusting the way you communicate for the other person, knowing how they receive the information.
Yeah.
Right. So it takes two to tango on that.
Well, let's talk about B.I.F.F. So you've already told us that it's an acronym, and it's B.I.F. like Frank, F like Frank.
Yes. And I always, for some reason, I always think of Back to the Future. like that that really aggressive
Bully.
character. Yeah, B.I.F.F, and that's how it sticks in my head for some reason. I'm
No,
like,
that's a
don't
good
be like
visual.
that, right?
It's the opposite,
Right,
which
it's
is
the opposite. I'm like,
anti-Biff.
don't be him. And really, I'm going to say an underlying principle of the entire thing is to avoid blame, right? You don't want to take blame, you don't want to place blame, because that either puts you in a vulnerable position or that puts the other person in a defensive position.
So that's
So
sort of the jumping off point.
I think so. That's my own personal, I'm going to say, perspective of a jumping off point. The concept really is, right, there's no advice, no admonishments, no apologies, because advice is the trigger to defensive reaction. We don't want to write something to someone that we know is going to trigger them
Yeah.
to defend themselves. The same thing with admonishment, right? So advice kind of comes from a I know better than you place, right? Admonishment is saying to someone, you did something wrong. Now, if Candace, I said, Candace, I can't believe you started this podcast that way. All of a sudden, you're going to be sparked to defend yourself because that's
Sure.
just who we are as people.
Sure.
So admonishments, you were perfectly fine in how you started this podcast, by the way.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate that.
But it's a defensive reaction. So really, you're telling someone they're doing something wrong. They're gonna automatically want to defend themselves. But apologies, now that one seems that's a little strange, right? Because
Counterintuitive, right?
right, because you would think, well, I'm going to take accountability, right, for something I did wrong. But if the other side is a high conflict personality, they're just going to like focus on that failure, and it's all going to become about that rather than resolving the issue and actually talking about the issue.
That's a good point.
So brief, we'll just
Yeah,
go
so
brief.
let's go to the first element of Biff, right? The first letter, B like boy, B like brief.
It should be like 3 to 5 sentences, period.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the less you say, the more you reduce that risk of triggering more hostility or having back and forth or including something that maybe not you shouldn't include. I am terrible at that, right? I have ADHD, and part of I'm going to say the manifestation of that for me is trying to explain when my brain goes to a random place. So I'll say, oh, unrelated, or I think I saw a meme the other day where it's like we always have parentheses explaining what we're saying. And so this is a challenge for me. So
Yeah.
this is the part where not the other parts, I'm okay with those, but this one I have to reread, put it aside, come back to it. And even like I do this every single day, right? So, but even talking to clients or anything else, I really have to cut down.
Yeah. I mean, I think the guidelines say in general that, when you have a message, you lose people as time ticks on, right? And the same is true if you're reading a message, right? So if we're talking about Biff, it's in writing. And I think the guidelines basically say you should try to make your point in a paragraph or less. And mostly it leaves a lot less material for the listener or the reader to harp on. So be concise, be precise, and be brief to the extent that you can. And in doing so, it will maybe in some ways reduce the listeners or the reader's ability to like you say, harp on or focus on one thing that may have been a slight misstep.
Right. I would be, it's funny because you said harp on and I was like, oh, I have, that's a trigger word for me. Because that has a connotation of it being a negative,
nagging.
Right. Rather than just maybe a focus in the wrong place.
Sure.
And so that's exactly what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
It's like everyone has their own relationship with words.
Totally.
And so the less words you have, not in this podcast, but on paper, the better you are.
Yeah. And so then we're moving on to I, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I is informative, which seems to be like it would be obvious.
Sure.
The purpose of the kind of communication we're talking about is that you're trying to get some point across, some information transferred from you to the other side of this conversation.
Right.
And it's often what I see in this when I'm working with co-parents is the need to point out that somebody else did something wrong, right? No, you're wrong. It's not 10 o'clock on Friday. The appointment is 10:30 on Friday. You always get that wrong, right? You never can keep an appointment, etc. None of that is necessary, right? You can just write back, the appointment is at 10 a.m. Whatever time I just said it was. And the information still gets there, but you don't need to point out all of the other things.
Right. So the other things could be your emotional feeling about certain things, right?
Right.
It could be your opinion about how you think something is going to go. There is a lot sort of in there that you're not supposed to say. You're supposed to forget the emotion, forget your commentary, forget your position, forget defending yourself. Just stay focused and stay on the facts.
Right. And that's really hard to do when you are in an emotional situation.
Yeah.
Because, even just saying the 10 o'clock appointment, be like, I don't know why you scheduled it so early in the morning, but the appointment's at 10. Right. Obviously, I'm not a morning riser.
Right.
But you don't need all of that information.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that it can be really hard when you're already sort of struggling with, being annoyed with whomever or anticipating what their response is going to be. So keeping it straight and to the point can only do you a favor. After informative, that's sort of like dovetails, which is friendly. The last thing many of us feel towards the listener, towards the reader, when it's already in the middle of a conflict, right? And so the advice is to keep it friendly, keep it light.
Because you want the other person to mirror your emotions. If I come into a situation and I'm stressed out, it's really hard for the other person to be positive. If I come into a situation and I'm positive, then it's harder for the other person to be negative because you just came in positively. I think the hitch here, and this is what I see a lot with my clients, is being over friendly such that it comes off completely insincere or sarcastic.
Yeah.
Sarcasm does not translate into writing, unfortunately, because I do it a lot, but it doesn't translate. So something that you intend to be friendly can come off as really, I'm going to say infantilizing.
Yeah.
Or like just overdone.
Well, you don't want to be patronizing, right?
That's it. That's exactly the word I was thinking of.
Yeah. Where it's got to be sincere, because you don't want to have it come off as patronizing, and you certainly don't want that to then be turned on you, and then it'll just devolve from that point. I think maybe the best way to sort of remember how to be friendly is how you'd speak to a stranger, right? Where you're polite and you're pleasant. And there's nothing attached to them. You don't know them. You have no feelings towards them. So why wouldn't you, be polite and be friendly in that way when you're communicating with someone that you have no feelings toward at all?
Right. I know. I think that's a great example. And it's like, thank you for sending me this email.
Yeah.
Right. Or thank you for bringing up this issue. Or, you don't have to say, I have clients that write like, I don't know, best when they're ending it. Like, and I'm like, no, but you're not offering the person your best. Like, just take that out. But the other thing that people will go too formal, right? So I'll tell like the F's that are bad. People go too formal.
Yeah.
I cannot tell you the amount of clients I have that start using Mr. or Mrs. for their co-parents. And I'm like, why are you calling them Mr. Smith? Like, did you call them Mr. Smith during your relationship? Do you call them Mr. Smith to their child? Like, no.
Yeah.
If the person's name is Bob, call the person Bob. If you had a nickname, no, you're not going to call them Schnookums anymore, right? But you don't need to be so formal that it feels completely unnatural. That is not friendly.
Well, it's interesting. This sort of came up, and I'll, quick anecdote. I was assisting a client who had feuding children, and she had a pretty significant health event, and one of the daughters lived close by and was a healthcare proxy, and one lived in California. And the mother was not in a position to be sort of sharing information with the daughter who lived far away in California. She had a pretty significant medical event, and the other daughter was sort of doing her best to keep the text exchange friendly. She does not like her sister. They don't get along. There have been issues stemming from years and years and years of conflict, none of which any of us, probably them also, could unravel and really fix at this point. But it was really important that the daughter who was close by provided concise information and was friendly, because she also recognized she was giving pretty bad news to her sister about their mom. And, you know, I think that one of the things that kept the communication civil and a free flow of information was that they let all of their interpersonal issues, which will continue forever, but they let it go during a high time of high stress in the text communication. And the mother was really relieved when everything, thank God, worked out for her. So, you know, it is true that having that friendly approach can sometimes go a long way. And while it won't change people, it could change that particular conversation and not have it devolve further.
Right. Right. And that's what we're talking about de-escalating, right?
Yeah.
Just not leaving it the same or not bringing it up a level. We want to de-escalate.
Right, exactly. And the last F of the B.I.F.F is firm, right?
Yes, which always confuses people, because people see firm as a negative
or unfriendly.
Right, or unfriendly. And it's not. It just means that you're not leaving a like a hook for the other person to have to come back to you.
Yeah.
It's not leading. It's not like saying looking for a detailed response.
Yeah.
And the other person might still have to answer a question if you're trying to get information rather than tell information, right? If you need a yes or no, try to make it a yes or no, right? It's sort of like
that's the best advice, right? So you're framing your questions, if you need information, with answers that are possible in one word, yes or no. So it's really important how you ask the questions and how you have the conversation, how the conversation is framed, so that you are firm in the communication.
Right. And a lot of examples are like, okay, please let me know by end of day Tuesday. I would take that a step further and say, like, I would appreciate if you could let me know by the end of business.
Yeah. Right? So boundaries and expectations are sort of part of that subcategory of firm, where you're really setting expectations for the reader, the listener, the person on the other end of the communication, to say that you want to hear back at a certain time, and here are the parameters and what I need. And in being firm and you know, providing sort of like a good framework, you're setting the parameters and the tone for the conversation and the information that you want to receive in response.
Right. And, you know, I would caution people to say, if you're in a high conflict, you want to be careful about saying, I need this, because the other person doesn't give two hoots about what you need.
Okay, right? That's true.
Right. Like, so
how would you frame it?
I would probably say, I would appreciate it, or tell the person why, right? Like, it's necessary for me to have this by the end of Thursday because enrollment ends on Friday. Right. Like, so that it just doesn't sound like you're setting an arbitrary deadline.
Well, that also goes, so, you know, that sentence alone is a good example of B.I.F.F, right? Because it's brief and it's informative. You've given them factual information about what you're asking for, and it's friendly. You're not saying, you know, give it to me this time because you didn't give it to me in time last time, right? Right. So you really, in that one sentence, you really did sort of hit each sort of subcategory of the B.I.F.F communication. So way to go, Jodi.
Thanks. It's almost like I do this. No. But, you know, no matter how many times I do email training with clients or colleagues, etc., and I literally just said email training, because I'm like, send me your email and then I'm going to tell you what's wrong with it, which takes a lot of ego setting aside for a lot of clients, right? Yeah. Like, what was wrong with the way I said it? Like, okay, well, let's go through it. Yeah. Right. Let's look at it, which is, I think, the like summary of everything, right? Because if you what you really should do is, if you get a message and you feel like you are having the desire to send back an answer right away, or it has some emotional impact on you, or if you're starting one and you know that it's going to be a difficult conversation, write it out the way you want to say it in a separate note, in a separate document, not in an email, or if it's in an email, not with the person's email address in the 2-line, right? Erase that person's thing until you get the message that you actually want to send. No, no correction. The message that you're actually going to send, not the one you want to. But if you take what you want to say and you write it out, it has come out of you, right? So from a emotional perspective, you have now gotten that, I'll say, satisfaction of it coming out of you, which is perfectly fine. It's sort of like journaling it first. And then pull out the necessary sentences. Usually it's about 25% of the information. This is just my experience, not like a survey, but 25% of the information that you started with. And because most of what we say to each other is extraneous or hedging, or or does things to put it into an emotional perspective, which is not what we're looking to do here.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, so in defense of our clients or people who are struggling with this, right? We're all human. And as you point out, we all come to whatever relationship where we're communicating with our own set of baggage, and our own issues and the way in which we've seen the world, what our life experiences are. So it's really hard to sort of strip down to the purest form to communicate in a way that really blocks out the noise of those things, right? Your past experiences, either with yourself or with the person that you're dealing with, the interpersonal piece. You talk about family dynamics on top of it. And I mean, I think this sort of communication methodology in writing can be a really useful exercise for anyone in your professional life, in your personal life, and certainly in times of high conflict. So this was a really sort of helpful lesson, I think, for me, for sure, and hopefully for our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I mean, some of us are going to have to learn how to use text abbreviations in order to do this with our kids, right? But
I just want to know why my son keeps calling me bruh.
Bruh.
Like,
I saw
bro?
a t-shirt that said like mommy, mom, bruh. Like,
bruh. Yeah, I don't get that. I mean, so, Jodi, what we're going to do in our resources is we'll link to this book and certainly to the social scientist who came up with this B.I.F.F acronym for us to make it easier on the rest of us to communicate more effectively and try to avoid conflict when we can, right?
Yeah, I think it's great. And we'll also throw into the links the reference for the nonviolent communication book, because it's also very helpful.
Yeah, thanks so much. I
Even if
learned
you
so
use
much.
A few words, they should be good ones.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks so much, Jodi. It was a great topic.
Awesome. Thank you.